Hello class, Mr. Ullman here, and I wanted to share with you a couple of topics today. First, invasive species, and second, biomagnification. Now, as you should know at this point, invasive species are a species that is removed from its natural habitat and is brought to a new habitat, and it does exceedingly well for a variety of reasons. Perhaps it's better adapted than its competitors, perhaps it has a lack of any predators, or it simply has some other competitive advantage over the other species in the area. Now, humans have been a major promoter of invasive species for thousands of years, ever since we were traveling from one part of the world to another. However, increases in shipping and in the ease of transportation and carelessness has certainly led to humans increasing the rate of invasive species spread. And as invasive species begin to take root in more and more ecosystems, it leads to a loss of diversity, and then you lose all of those positive impacts that diversity can bring, including sources of food, the genetic diversity, the resistance to disturbances, and certainly untold treasures to humans, things like medicines and other ways in which we might benefit. So it's important for us to consider how can we best approach the problem. If there is an invasive species, how can we get rid of it? And that problem doesn't have an easy solution. So that's what I want to talk about today. And I'll use the story of the spotted knapweed. And this is a species that is from Eastern Europe and has been in the United States for quite some time now and is spread throughout actually much of North America, United States, and into southern Canada. And you see the picture here. This is the flower, the spotted knapweed. It produces a lot of seeds. First of all, it is grass. The flowers produce a lot of seeds which are carried by the wind, and they are very productive. So a lot of seeds produced, and as it gets dispersed by the wind, produces a lot more plants. It has a very deep growing taproot, and so it can outcompete its competitors for water. And so it's a pretty hardy plant, capable of growing in a lot of varied conditions. And the perhaps most helpful is that it has the absence of any primary herbivore. So as this plant is growing, other animals and other insects will prefer to eat other plants before they will eat the spotted knapweed. And even more so, it's not a very good source of food for those insects or animals. So animals tend to stay away, and if they stay away, then it's more likely that the plant will grow and reproduce, make more seeds that will make more plants. And that cycle will continue. Meanwhile, all of its competitors are getting eaten up by the insects and by those animals. So five methods were identified by U.S. Forest Service to deal with this. Number 1, releasing biological control insects. Number 2, seeding with native seed. Number 3, mowing and grazing. 4, herbicides. And 5, mechanical removal. Okay, here we look at what will happen if we introduce seeds of other plants to act as competitors to the knapweed. And these would be native species that are being actively spread in order to compete with the invasive species. And you can see on the left and on the right, you can see a control if nothing is done versus the experimental if the neighbors are going to be removed. So they're looking to see how does the knapweed do when it has no competitors, neighbors removed, versus if it does have competitors. And you see that the knapweed improved in the lower meadow, but it was within a statistical margin of error in the upper meadow. And that's what those little bars mean. That's showing the margin of error, and so you can see that on the left versus on the right, that the bars overlap. When the bars overlap, that means that there's not a significant difference between the data sets. So here you can see that there's not a consistent result. The knapweed doesn't necessarily do better or worse, at least not consistently, depending on whether or not there are some competitors nearby. The second option is to find a natural predator of the species. In this case, it would be a couple of species of weevils that could be brought in from Europe, introduce those into the US, into the areas where the knapweed is growing, and have that insect eat this particular type of bug, so eat this particular plant. When we look at the results, you can see, again, the error bars are not entirely overlapping, so you can see when both of the insects are introduced, there is a significant decrease in the amount of biomass present for the knapweed. Similarly, the number of flowers per plant also significantly decreasing. So there you're seeing for sure that this is having an impact. Now the question is, are there any unintended consequences of bringing in another species? Because that weevil is necessarily going to be a second invasive species. Will it eat other plants? Will it be a pest in some other means that is maybe not necessarily predicted? And that's the very difficult thing to be able to do. Until that insect is actually brought to the US and introduced into the wild, it's hard to predict exactly whether or not it's going to have any of those secondary unintended consequences. Looking down at the next strategy, which is herbicides. So to use chemicals, spray chemicals onto the areas where the knapweed is growing, chemicals that are known to kill the knapweed, and to see what is the overall change. In this case, this graph is showing the change in species richness. So you can see that if it is untreated, there's a decrease in species richness. We should expect that there's going to be a drop overall in the number of species that are present in an area. Then listed at below are 4 different types of treatments. And we can compare to see those 4 different herbicides, what is the impact of spraying them in those areas. And in certainly 3 out of the 4 cases, we see that there is a consistent and long-term, multi-year increase in species richness, because as the knapweed dies out, other species are able to move in and take their place. Perhaps species that previously had been crowded out and moved out of a particular community now can recolonize and come back in to take the space that the knapweed used to have. Now, as we compare that to the idea of abundance, because remember that diversity is measured by number of species, richness, and the relative amounts, which is abundance. And so in this case, when the herbicide is given, we see that here we had the N and H. The N areas have no herbicide, the H areas have the herbicide. And so as we look through each of these boxes, we can see, again, with the places with the stars have the herbicide, and you can see that abundance decreases with the herbicide all the way across, whereas the larger bars all are ones that were not treated with the herbicide. So here, the percent of area that's covered by each species, okay, which is relative abundance, that is actually decreasing. So by adding the herbicide, we have increased species richness but decreased abundance, and therefore there is a more, when we look at diversity as a whole, is fairly flat. So it's important to be able to really look at this from multiple perspectives, because if you were to only do one of these 2 studies, you wouldn't get as clear a picture of what's really going on as you should. So as we go back to this idea of the knapweed, that again, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer. The question is more which of the possible treatments is going to be cost effective or not, which is going to have the greatest impact on decreasing the invasive species or not, and which of them is more likely to have unintended secondary consequences or not. And it really needs to be decided on a case-by-case basis, depending on the species and depending on the community that invasive species is living in. Now, secondly, looking at biomagnification. This is the spread of a toxin. So in this case, humans are putting toxins into the environment that are then being taken up by food chains. So we're looking at chemical substances here that are becoming more concentrated from one trophic level to the next. So some examples: DDT, dioxins, pesticides, TBT, and mercury are all pretty solid examples that we have seen many documented cases of. The basic idea is that when you have, if you look here, you have small fish. If you have 4 small fish, each with 20 parts per million of a toxin inside their bodies, which they had gotten from their environment, then all 4 of those fish are eaten by the big fish. Now, the toxins from each of those 4 little fish are now all within that one larger fish, and so that as this big fish continues to eat those little fish, it is accumulating more and more and more of those toxins in its body. So there's an increase in concentration with each level higher you go on the trophic level, or on the trophic scale. And so this is referred to as biomagnification. If we look at DDT as a great case study here for how this process works, DDT was a synthetic pesticide that was used to be able to fight off insects, and it was particularly good also at being able to control mosquitoes. So it was sprayed in a lot of areas where malaria was a problem. However, once it was sprayed on fields, when the rain fell, that DDT was washed away into waterways and eventually into rivers, lakes, and oceans. And that DDT, once it was in the ocean, began to get taken up by the plankton that was in the water. The plankton is eaten by the small fish are eaten by the big fish are eaten by the birds. And so you can see that the number of parts per million in the water versus the zooplankton, the small fish, the large fish, and in those fish-eating birds, the parts per million continues to increase as we move up to those higher trophic levels. Once it gets in the bird, it's stored in fats, and one of the ways in which it ended up having a long-term consequence was the fact that that birds that had DDT in their bodies produced eggs that had very thin shells, and so the shells tended to break before the baby birds were completely developed, and so they were not successfully reproducing. Furthermore, it was also causing an impact in humans. We saw an increase in birth defects, an increase in cancers as a result of humans eating animals that had DDT in them. As a result of studies done on this, DDT was banned and is no longer produced or in use in any part of the world because it was found that this particular chemical had this effect on those upper levels of the food chain. A couple of other examples: dioxins are a industrial byproduct that there is no safe level of, and so they are even more potent in terms of being cancer-causing and causing reproductive problems in humans. Particularly young people are very susceptible to it. And mercury is another problem. We look throughout our part of the country in the Midwest because we burn coal. There's mercury found in coal, and so the mercury gets released into the air and then gets caught up in the rain and brought back down into the waterways. And so there's limits on the amount of fish that people should eat, certain types of fish that people should eat, and particularly young children and pregnant mothers should not eat a lot of certain types of fish because if the fish is in a higher trophic level, if it's a tertiary or quaternary consumer and a person is eating that fish, then they're going to end up getting more of those toxins like mercury into their bodies. And then other heavy metals, selenium is another example. TBT, another which was used as a sealant on ships. These are other examples of chemicals, but they all work in the same way. They make their way into the producers and into the plankton that are in those waterways, and then gradually increase in concentration and eventually affecting certainly humans. And so the less that we use these particular types of pollutants, the less likely it is that we're going to see this impact on the food chain.